to have you here today on this Saturday morning. We went out dancing, our feet sore, no? Yes. I'm so excited to come to you with this wealth report because it shows some amazing progress. But one thing I've learned from covering business news is if you're looking backwards, it's not always really helpful if what you really want to do is look forward. And so I want to acknowledge what has been accomplished, but I also want to go and spend more time on where it's going, where U.S. Latinos are going. For instance, when we looked at the GDP report that said $3.6 trillion, that's a snapshot of time in 2022. What I found so remarkable was the research economists saying, yes, but by 2029, that's going to be $5.7 trillion. That growth is remarkable. When we talk about goals, there are 4 for the Hispanic Wealth Project, focusing on these areas of home ownership, business ownership, financial assets, and asset protection. Elizabeth, can we start with you and talk a little bit about the home ownership? That goal that got laid out by NAHREP and by the Hispanic Wealth Project was 50% home ownership by U.S. Latinos by 2024. Where have we come?
Thank you. So as we saw in the homeownership report that was released in the spring, first of all, we are now at 49.5% homeownership in the Latino community. So that is huge growth since the inception of the Hispanic Wealth Project. Just also to give a little bit of context on why the goal was 50%, at that 50% point, that then means that the median household in the Latino community would have home equity as part of their wealth. So really just growing the wealth of the community overall. Now, I think one thing to keep in mind as we talk about the Latino community in all different aspects, but particularly homeownership and growing wealth, is the fact that the Latino community is so young. So the median age of the Latino community is 35, which is about 11 years younger than the general population overall. And the reason that's important is because it just opens a wealth of possibilities in terms of asset appreciation, certainly in terms of homeownership. You know, you think about if that's the median age, Latinos are really just now aging into their prime home buying years. And so you can think about that as sort of an indication that this trend will only continue. In addition, you've probably all heard this stat before because the NAHREP loves it, but the Urban Institute found several years ago that between 2020 and 2040, 70% of net new homeowners will be Latino. Yeah. So I think in terms of homeownership and Latinos growing wealth in general, but certainly homeownership, it's just going to go up from here.
Given that I'm looking right here, borrowers younger than 35, 45% of Latinos are younger than 35 for their primary residence. That number is 40% for non-Hispanics. Let's talk a little bit about what is driving that growth. What policies, Janis, are in place that make it a real opportunity for young Latinos to buy primary homes?
Yes, well, first of all, I know we're doing the forward look, but I do need to acknowledge that for many of you in this room, we all worked together during the 2008 foreclosure crisis, which was the part of the origin story for the Hispanic Wealth Project. We lost 60% of our wealth in that crisis. And we went through an entire pandemic where that didn't happen. And so I want to start there because we learned our lesson. We took preventative measures. We put in place the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, the Homeowners Assistance Fund, to make sure that we didn't fly over that eviction and foreclosure cliff, so that we're actually in a position not to be trying to regain ground once again, but we were actually in a position of strength to be growing our homeownership rate. So that's fundamentally important. We didn't backslide, and you all know that that wasn't something we could take for granted. That was policy choices that made that possible. The next thing that the Treasury Department has been doing is really trying to make sure that there is access to flexible capital, including the ability to purchase mortgages. We put $1.6 billion investment in Latino-owned banks and credit unions. Over the next 10 years, we think that's going to be an additional $50 billion worth of lending. Over the program overall, not just to Latino borrowers, but overall, just in its first 18 months, was over $2 billion in mortgages. These are institutions that are highly proximate. They should be your partners, Latino-owned banks, credit unions, CDFIs. They're able to put capital out, sometimes with more flexible underwriting standards, sometimes with more flexible rates. And so I think that is also helping those on the margins for whom they might otherwise not be able to qualify.
Sara, when you're looking at what is making this surge in homeownership possible, is it, and especially, I think this is remarkable, 71% of US Latinos buying homes are buying in middle income or upper income areas. Is that because they want bigger houses or because they're buying in more expensive urban areas?
I think that's such a great question. And I think that, it's great that we're looking forward into where are we going as a Hispanic community, but it's important that the data that we're looking at is correct. I think a lot of the times people bank us, all of Latinos, like we're one, the same size fits all, when it's not the case. Latinos are very different when it comes to their culture, how they're looking at money, where they're getting their resources, what they're, finding their education. And a lot of the times they treat us that same way. There's like this idea that Latinos are only buying in low income areas, where there's a lot of different types of Latinos. Number one, we do see that a lot of Latinos are starting to get more educated. They're getting better jobs. They're starting to get, more money saving. Mary's going to talk to us about how, they're starting to go, like people who are educated and are investing in diversifying their portfolios are actually starting to create wealth really fast. And those people are buying in those high net worth areas. But there's also other Latinos that have to bundle together 3 or 4 families to come together to be able to afford a home. So then I think that's skewing the numbers a little bit, where we're looking at, yes, Latinos are buying into affluent areas, so maybe they don't need the help, but that's not the reality of it. The reality is that they're needing to live in areas that are high concentration, low affordability, so they're having to be creative as to how to be able to afford those homes.
We know that the wealth gap is shrinking, but that it still exists, and it still exists in a way that is remarkable and problematic if you want to see parity in lots of different areas. We know that education is increasing and is outpacing non-Latinos. That matters. Let's talk a little bit about business ownership. Mary, give us a sense, if you will, what the hurdles are when someone wants to become an entrepreneur for the first time and then build their business.
Yeah, I would say some of the hurdles that we have seen is the lack of education. You start out with, I want to do something. I want to do something next. I start as a solopreneur. Where do I start? How do I start? How do I register an LLC? What's the difference between an LLC or a corporation? How do I manage my cash book? So we've launched a HEFA bootcamp at Suma Wealth. You guys, can all check us out. And we launched it about, I would say, 8 weeks ago, and now we have 1,200 people who have signed up and are taking the classes, and it all starts out with them understanding, do I become an LLC, do I become a corporation, or do I try to be a solopreneur for just a little bit?
So that expert advice being available and accessible is important. Just looping that back to property ownership, is it problematic then that the balance has changed for buyers agents, for brokers? What do you think, Sara?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I know that there was a lot of sessions when it came to NAR, but it's all, as we're talking in this panel, it's about education, guys. And one of the things that I'm most proud about NAHREP is that we are influencers in our communities. We are out there taking the information from Treasury. Janis and I were talking, we were saying like, okay, I'm head of the Hispanic Wealth Project, and I didn't even know about all these resources that were being put out there. So we need to be able to put them out in the community. It's about educating ourselves on, you know, a lot of Latina-owned businesses had to close through the pandemic, but now they're all coming back and they're coming stronger because we learned our lessons from having to lose our businesses by being solopreneurs and starting to look at that education, like how do I get educated? Who do I connect myself with in order to be able to go into having an employee-based work? With the buyer's agent, I think there's, again, this misnomer, miscommunication, where they think that it's going to really impact the bottom line and be better for consumers, but it's going to be very detrimental. Because the problem is that home buyers, the Hispanic community is young, they don't know what they don't know, they have all these misconceptions about home buying, and they're not going to ask the questions. So instead of being able to have somebody who represents them, the sellers are not going to get any savings. I'm not seeing it at the table. I'm a title company. We do about 10 to 15 closings a day. And can I tell you that I have not seen not one seller in the multiple closings that we're doing all across 5 different states. I'm not seeing one seller who has saved $1. I'm not seeing one. I'm not seeing any lowering in the home values. What I'm seeing is buyers, regardless if they're buying a $60,000, $80,000 property or a $7 million property, I'm seeing buyers who are struggling to see how do I get representation who is really going to help me with the biggest asset that I'm ever going to own.
So this is, like, clearly that's going to be a disruptive force in the way that homes and properties are bought and sold. I want to move to financial assets because now we're seeing the goal to increase the share of Hispanic households owning non-cash financial assets to 50% or greater. How's the progress going on that front, Elizabeth?
I mean, I think as with business ownership and home ownership, the trend is very positive, which is great. I will say financial assets, the growth has been slower. I think largely to Mary's point, I think a lot of that has to do with education. People, a lot of financial assets, whether it be stocks or, retirement accounts, things like that, a lot of people, not just Latinos, but in particular, don't know how to utilize these assets. They're very intimidated by them. But the trend, as I said, is positive. It's just growing a little more slowly. Right now, we see, for example, that about 30% of Hispanic households have a retirement account. Now, obviously, that is really concerning when you think about the fact that that is a large swath of the population that doesn't necessarily have a plan for the future. However, again, I think this is where age, things start to look much more optimistic when you take age into account. Certainly because not only are young Latinos, they're getting educated now, but also they have so much more time for these assets to appreciate.
And we're seeing more schools start to look at financial literacy as being a critical component of overall education. And look, as the mom of 11-year-old boys, I'm all for it. I'm like, and somebody other than me should probably be teaching you. As we know. But Mary, when people are coming onto Suma Wealth platform, are you surprised at the variety of non-cash assets your customers are bringing to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything, not just from the cash assets, but from them having an emergency savings account. Oh. They're connecting their bank accounts, we're seeing their data, and they don't have an emergency savings account. So if you start with the baseline of what a person needs to get going, before they start investing, before they start purchasing a home, they should have that emergency savings account just in case anything happens, but they're not seeing the value. So part of our job is to educate them.
And can I just say too that emergency savings account is so important over the course of wealth building because one of the, life happens. Life's gonna happen no matter what. And we see hits to 401ks or IRAs or retirement accounts because of an emergency, hits to home wealth if somebody has to cash out because something happens. And so making sure that we create those vehicles for liquid savings are incredibly important to the overall wealth picture for families.
You know, if I can say something, I think our job here today as influencers in our community is bringing these resources and these tools to our community, but it's telling the success stories, right? Because like I was talking to Mary about Suma Wealth and about how people who are aware of these tools and are engaging with these tools are growing their wealth at a higher rate than anybody else, even if they started the same. And I think as influencers in your community, you have to tell these success stories, because the mindset that we have as Latinos sometimes, coming from countries where, you know, your bank could shut down and then all of your wealth was gone, or the bank could say after this amount, the government's gonna take it. So I think it's important for us to look at the resources that the government has and tell the success stories from other Latinos in your community and engage them in using these tools, because there is a innate distrust to start using these tools because we're so afraid of what we don't know.
By the way, in part of the planning, you know, is what are you going to be when you grow up? And Janis, what we're seeing is the areas of growth fueling the economy are rapidly changing.
That's right. This is, I want to talk about the conversation I want to be having a year from now. Where's Gary? I hope Gary invites me back. We'll have this conversation again in a year. So this is your official kickoff to really thinking about what's happening. Okay, so you had the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. You're talking about trillions of dollars of public investment flowing into the community, and nothing builds a middle class like public investment. The problem is that over the course of our history, Black and brown communities have been intentionally, on more than one occasion, excluded from those investments. This time it's coming around, and we have the opportunity to see it and make sure that we are part of the change. Where the economy is going with the investments in AI, with bringing chips manufacturing into this country, it's good for our national security. We want those chips to be produced here. This was a big learning during the pandemic of how vulnerable we were when we didn't produce the technology here inside the country. We need to be more climate resilient, but we also need to be part of the companies that are building and installing solar panels, the companies that are installing EV chargers, the companies that are managing the logistics and the transport of chips. There are a number of industries, and I think that the job for us now is to map where the future of the economy is going. So this is our homework. This is the conversation we're going to have a year from now. Look at where is the economy going and how do we line up our businesses and our entrepreneurs to be able to take advantage of that. It takes 5 years, roughly or more, to build a fabrication center for chips manufacturing. That's time that we have to line up our businesses to make sure that we are part of that growth.
I love it.
Many of you know that I cover insurance for CNBC, and one of the things that has come to my attention is that in many areas of the country, access to adequate coverage is either very hard to get or extremely unaffordable. And across most of the country, you have people who are getting sticker shock over their property or their car insurance. That says nothing else about cyber insurance for your business. Casualty insurance rates are going up. Can we talk a little bit about asset protection? And all, I'm talking about insurance because that's what I know, but that includes estate planning and things like that. And what we're seeing, Mary, can I start with you?
Yeah, I would say for asset protection and even starting with your will, there's also a lot of lack of knowledge as to why I do that. Why should I do that? I mean, my parents are gonna, my kids are gonna be there. I don't need to do this. Well, we have to start educating at all levels of our community why will and estate planning is very important.
What do you think, Sara?
I mean, I can tell you so many stories that I see at the table when somebody's forced to sell an asset at a loss, or where they were banking that that was going to be the legacy that they were going to leave their children or their spouse. I had this case where it was really sad. This gentleman had been married before. He was married now with a couple of kids, but he didn't have a will. So the way the law in Virginia happens is that he died in a terrible accident, and now his house is split between the previous children, who were nowhere to be found because they were in another country, and the house here. That widow, who was left with nothing because they hadn't prepared, basically spent all of the money that they would have had in that equity that that man worked so hard for on paying attorneys. To get that house sold so she wasn't under on that mortgage. That, to me, is the biggest way for us to lose our hard-earned wealth. So it's not about preparing to die. It's about preparing our legacy that we're going to leave our families by leaving them all set so that wealth actually transfers to them.
And Janis, Treasury.
Yeah, I think this is a really critical emerging issue. Treasury is in progress now of mapping the impact of climate change on insurance availability. We are seeing this in flood zones and fire zones, just really pressing, again, the intersection of the economic consequences of climate change and the need for resiliency, but also the need for accountability amongst insurance companies. So that'll be some of my homework for you. We're in the middle of doing that now, and I can bring it back.
I mean, we need another 30 minutes on asset protection when it comes to Treasury as well.
Remind them to download the report, please.
Yes. You can download the Hispanic Wealth Report, read all the data. It's really fascinating. I'm out of time, but because, Elizabeth, you're in charge of collating this and presenting it, what's your big takeaway and what you think needs to have the most focus for next year?
Well, first of all, I will say I'm one of many co-authors, so thanks to the whole team who put the report together. I think that, as I mentioned, I think the only way is up. And I think that putting some of these principles into action, we were discussing a little bit earlier, these are things that can start quite literally today. You know, you might not be able to close on a house in the next 24 hours, but you can start, you can open a 401k today. You could start, an IRA or whatever the case may be, you can start saving, or you could call an attorney to talk about a living trust or a will. Those are things that you can put into action immediately. And so I think that what we would really like for this panel to be is we want you to leave here thinking that these are things that are achievable as well.
Thank you all for being a great audience. Thanks for having us.